Picture this: a grieving widow, still mourning her husband's sacrifice for this country, gets slapped with $1,000 fine for having the audacity to plant flowers in memory of her fallen hero. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness the most jaw-dropping HOA takedown in neighborhood history. Margaret Chen thought she was doing something beautiful, creating a small memorial garden where her husband David's ashes were scattered. What she didn't know was that the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had been watching her every move, documenting every violation, building a case that would ultimately backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. The HOA board president, Richard Hartwell, had made it his personal mission to enforce every single rule in their 47-page covenant document. But when he decided to target a Gold Star widow during her darkest hour, he had no idea he was about to face a reckoning that would shake their pristine suburban community to its very core. This isn't just another HOA horror story. This is about what happens when petty power meets unwavering determination, when bureaucratic bullying collides with a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Buckle up, because Margaret Chen was about to teach an entire neighborhood what real strength looks like. Margaret Chen had never wanted to be anyone's hero. At 62 years old, she just wanted to grieve in peace. Her husband, David, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before retiring as a master sergeant after 22 years in the Army. When he passed away from complications related to his service just 18 months ago, Margaret felt like her entire world had crumbled. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Drive had been their dream retirement home. They'd saved for decades to afford a place in Willowbrook Estates, one of those picture-perfect planned communities where every lawn was precisely manicured and every mailbox was regulation black with gold lettering. David used to joke that it was like living inside a magazine spread, but he loved the order and discipline of it all. It reminded him of military base housing, but with better amenities and no surprise inspections. Or so they thought. Willowbrook Estates was governed by one of the most comprehensive HOA covenants in the entire county. The community boasted a pristine clubhouse, 2 tennis courts, a swimming pool, and walking trails that wound through carefully maintained common areas. Property values had steadily climbed over the past decade, making it a crown jewel in the suburban landscape. But beneath that polished surface lurked something darker. The HOA board, led by Richard Hartwell, operated with the precision of a military unit and the compassion of a tax audit. Hartwell, a retired insurance executive with silver hair and perpetually pressed polo shirts, had served as board president for 7 consecutive years. His philosophy was simple. Rules existed for a reason, and exceptions led to chaos. Now, you might be wondering how someone like Margaret ended up in Hartwell's crosshairs. The truth is, she'd been flying under the radar for months after David's death. Neighbors would wave politely when she ventured out to get her mail, but mostly they left the grieving widow alone. She kept to herself, maintained her property to basic standards, and tried to navigate the overwhelming bureaucracy of veteran benefits and insurance claims. The trouble began in early spring when Margaret decided to create something meaningful in David's memory. She'd had his remains cremated as he'd requested, but instead of keeping the ashes on her mantle, she wanted to scatter them somewhere special. David had always loved their backyard, particularly the corner near the old oak tree where he'd installed a small bench overlooking the community pond. Margaret chose a quiet Sunday morning in March to hold her private ceremony. She scattered David's ashes around the base of the oak tree, said a prayer, and made a decision that would change everything. She was going to plant a memorial garden. It started small and innocent enough. Margaret visited the local nursery and carefully selected plants that held special meaning. Roses because David had given her a dozen red ones on their first anniversary. Lavender because it had grown wild near the base where they'd first met. Marigolds because they'd planted them together in their very first apartment's tiny balcony garden 40 years ago. The garden was beautiful, tasteful, and created with nothing but love. Margaret spent hours each morning tending to her plants, finding solace in the routine of watering and weeding. Neighbors walking by would often stop to compliment the colorful display, and Margaret would smile softly and explain it was in memory of her husband. But someone else was watching too. Richard Hartwell had noticed the new plantings during his weekly property compliance drives, a self-appointed patrol where he would slowly cruise through the neighborhood, documenting any potential violations. The memorial garden immediately caught his attention, not because it was unsightly, but because it hadn't been approved. According to Section 4.7 of the Willowbrook Estates Architectural Control Guidelines, any landscaping modifications beyond basic lawn maintenance require written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. This included new flower beds, changes to existing planted areas, and the installation of any decorative elements. Hartwell pulled up the HOA records for 1247 Maple Grove Drive. No application had been submitted, no approval had been granted. In his mind, this was a clear violation, regardless of the circumstances. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. And stay with me because this is where things get absolutely wild. Hartwell didn't immediately issue a violation notice. Instead, he began building what he called a compliance case. He drove by Margaret's house at different times of day, taking photos of the garden from various angles. He measured the square footage of the new plantings using a surveyor's wheel. He even researched the specific types of flowers to determine if any were on the community's prohibited species list. For 6 weeks, Hartwell documented everything while Margaret remained completely unaware that she was under surveillance. She continued caring for her memorial garden, finding it one of the few sources of comfort during her extended grief process. Some mornings she would sit on David's bench with her coffee, watching the sun rise and talking to him about her day. The flowers seemed to listen in ways that people couldn't. Other neighbors began to take notice of the positive change in Margaret. Mrs. Patterson from next door mentioned how lovely the garden looked and how nice it was to see Margaret getting some fresh air again. The Johnsons from across the street complimented the beautiful color combinations and asked for gardening advice for their own backyard. But Hartwell saw something entirely different. He saw precedent. He saw the potential for chaos if other homeowners decided they could modify their landscaping without proper approval. He saw his authority being challenged, even if that challenge was unintentional. The community of Willowbrook Estates had always prided itself on uniform beauty and maintained property values. Every deviation from the established standards was seen as a threat to that carefully crafted image. Hartwell genuinely believed he was protecting something valuable, the investment that every homeowner had made in their slice of suburban paradise. What he failed to understand was that he was about to go head-to-head with someone who had already lost the most important thing in her world. Margaret Chen had nothing left to fear and everything to fight for. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered via certified mail with Margaret's name spelled incorrectly. The official Willowbrook Estates letterhead made her hands shake as she read the formal language accusing her of unauthorized landscape modification and failure to obtain proper architectural approval. Margaret read the notice 3 times, trying to understand how planting flowers in memory of her deceased husband could be considered a violation. The letter demanded immediate remediation, meaning she had to remove the entire memorial garden, and included a fine of $250 for the initial violation. But wait, because this is where Hartwell's true character really starts to show. The notice wasn't just about the garden. During his weeks of surveillance, he documented additional violations that Margaret had never even considered. Her mailbox had a small American flag decal that wasn't mentioned in her original property disclosure. The memorial wind chime hanging from her porch, a gift from David's Army unit, apparently violated the noise ordinance. Even the small solar lights she'd installed along the garden's border were cited as unauthorized electrical installations. The total fine came to $675, with an additional $50 per day until full compliance was achieved. Margaret stared at the notice in disbelief. She'd lived in the community for nearly 4 years without a single complaint. She kept her lawn immaculate, never left her trash cans out past collection day, and had even volunteered to help with the community newsletter before David's illness consumed all her time and energy. Now remember where we are in this story, because what happens next shows you exactly the kind of person Margaret was dealing with. Instead of calling or visiting to discuss the violations, Margaret decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. She spent days preparing, researching the covenants, and gathering documentation about her garden's creation and purpose. She printed photos of the memorial flowers and wrote a brief statement explaining the emotional significance of the space. The monthly board meeting was held in the community clubhouse on the third Thursday of each month. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a folder with her prepared materials. She'd dressed in her best Sunday outfit, a navy blue dress David had always complimented, and had even visited the salon to have her hair styled. She wanted to make a good impression and resolve this misunderstanding quickly. The meeting began with typical HOA business: budget discussions, maintenance updates, and upcoming community events. Margaret waited patiently through 45 minutes of mundane administrative details before the public comment period was announced. When she stood to address the board, her voice was steady but quiet. She introduced herself, explained her situation, and respectfully requested permission to maintain her memorial garden. She shared that the flowers were planted where her husband's ashes were scattered, and that tending to them had become an important part of her healing process. Hartwell's response was swift and brutal. He acknowledged Mrs. Chen's loss, but emphasized that personal circumstances didn't supersede community standards. Rules existed to protect property values and maintain the aesthetic integrity that all residents had agreed to uphold. Exceptions couldn't be made, regardless of the emotional reasoning behind them. But here's where things get truly shocking, and I need you to stick with me because this is about to get so much worse before it gets better. The board voted unanimously to uphold all violations and denied Margaret's request for retroactive approval. Hartwell added that failure to comply within the next 2 weeks would result in additional fines and potential legal action to force compliance. Margaret left that meeting feeling humiliated and confused. She'd expected compassion, or at least understanding. Instead, she felt like she'd been treated as a criminal for grieving her husband in the only way that brought her comfort. The violations escalated quickly from there. When Margaret didn't immediately remove her memorial garden, daily fines began accumulating. Hartwell instituted what he called enhanced monitoring of her property, which meant documented inspections every other day. He began citing increasingly petty violations: grass that was 1 inch taller than the regulation height, a newspaper left on her driveway past 10 a.m., and even her car parked at a slight angle in her own driveway. Within a month, Margaret's total fines exceeded $1,500. The daily violation notices became a source of constant stress, arriving like clockwork and documenting infractions that seemed to multiply overnight. Hartwell's documentation was meticulous: photos, measurements, timestamps, and detailed descriptions of each alleged violation. But Margaret wasn't the only one taking notice of Hartwell's tactics. Other neighbors began to whisper about the increasingly aggressive enforcement. Mrs. Patterson, Margaret's next-door neighbor, received a violation notice for having a welcome mat that was 2 inches larger than the regulation size. The Johnsons were cited for planting tulips in their front flower bed without submitting a seasonal landscaping modification request. The community began to split into factions. Hartwell's supporters argued that consistent enforcement was necessary to protect their property investments. They pointed out that every homeowner had signed the same covenants and should be held to the same standards. But a growing number of residents felt that the enforcement had become unnecessarily harsh and targeted. Here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. And trust me, you're not going to believe what Margaret discovered next. During one of her sleepless nights researching HOA law and her rights as a homeowner, Margaret stumbled across something interesting in the county property records. She'd been trying to understand the legal basis for Hartwell's authority when she noticed discrepancies in how different violations were being handled. Margaret began requesting copies of all violation notices issued over the past 2 years, which were public record according to state law. What she found was a pattern of selective enforcement that would make your blood boil. Hartwell's own property had multiple violations that had never been cited: an unauthorized deck extension, landscaping modifications that exceeded the approved plan, and even a storage shed that violated setback requirements. More shocking was the discovery that several board members had received administrative warnings for violations that would have resulted in immediate fines for other residents. The board had created an informal appeals process for themselves while strictly enforcing penalties against non-board members. Margaret realized she wasn't just fighting for her memorial garden anymore. She was uncovering systematic abuse of power that had been going on for years, hidden behind the facade of community standards and property protection. But Hartwell wasn't finished with her yet. When Margaret's fines reached $2,000 and she still refused to remove David's memorial garden, he escalated to the nuclear option that would ultimately seal his own fate. He filed a lien against her property and initiated foreclosure proceedings to collect the outstanding HOA debts. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Friday afternoon in late July, exactly 4 months after Margaret had planted her first memorial rose. The legal document, thick with incomprehensible jargon and dire warnings, informed her that Willowbrook Estates HOA was moving to seize her property to satisfy outstanding fines and fees that had now ballooned to over $4,000. Margaret sat in her kitchen reading the same paragraph over and over, trying to process the reality that she could lose the home she and David had worked 30 years to afford, the house where they'd planned to grow old together. The place where his ashes were scattered was beneath flowers that had never harmed anyone. But here's where this story takes the most incredible turn you can imagine. Because Margaret Chen was about to remind everyone exactly whose widow they were messing with. That evening, Margaret made a phone call that would change everything. She reached out to David's former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Williams, who had remained close to the family after David's retirement. Margaret explained her situation, her voice breaking as she described the HOA's actions and the threat to lose her home. Colonel Williams was quiet for a long moment after Margaret finished her story. Then she said something that sent chills down Margaret's spine. "Margaret, you need to understand something." And David didn't just serve his country, he saved lives. And there are a lot of people who owe their lives to your husband's actions overseas. Let me make some calls. What Margaret didn't know was that David had been awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for his actions during his final deployment. He'd never talked about the details, but his unit had encountered an ambush that could have resulted in catastrophic casualties. David's quick thinking and selfless actions had not only saved lives, but had earned him the respect and eternal gratitude of dozens of servicemen who'd made it home because of his heroism. Those servicemen were now veterans living all across the country, and many of them had become successful in their civilian careers. When Colonel Williams started making calls, word spread quickly through the tight-knit veteran community about what was happening to David Chen's widow. Now stay with me, because what happened next is absolutely unbelievable. Within 72 hours, Margaret's story had reached local veteran organizations, military support groups, and eventually the regional media. A reporter from the county newspaper contacted Margaret for an interview, and she agreed, finally ready to share her story publicly. The article, titled "Gold Star Widow Faces Foreclosure Over Memorial Garden," appeared in the Sunday edition and was immediately picked up by other news outlets. The story included photos of Margaret's beautiful memorial garden, David's military honors, and details about the HOA's escalating fines and foreclosure action. The community response was swift and overwhelming. Margaret's phone rang constantly with calls from strangers offering support, legal assistance, and donations to help fight the HOA. Local veterans groups organized protests outside Hartwell's own home, carrying signs that read, "Honor our heroes" and "Shame on Willowbrook HOA." But the real pressure came from an unexpected source. Property management companies that handled other HOA communities in the area began distancing themselves from Willowbrook estates. Potential home buyers started canceling contracts and looking elsewhere. The negative publicity was threatening the very property values Hartwell claimed to be protecting. Here's where Hartwell made his biggest mistake. And I promise you, this is where justice finally starts to be served. Instead of backing down or attempting damage control, Hartwell doubled down. He stated to the media, defending the HOA's actions and emphasizing that rules applied equally to all residents regardless of personal circumstances. He argued that allowing exceptions would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the community's standards. The statement was tone-deaf, callous, and revealed exactly the kind of person Margaret was dealing with. But it also provided something crucial, evidence of his mindset and motivations that would soon be very important. Remember how I mentioned Margaret had discovered selective enforcement and violations on board members' own properties? Well, she'd been quietly building a comprehensive case with the help of a pro bono attorney who'd reached out after reading her story. The legal discovery process revealed even more damaging information. Internal HOA emails showed Hartwell discussing Margaret's situation in dismissive terms, referring to her as "that woman with the dead soldier husband," and strategizing about how to force her compliance more quickly. Other board members had expressed concerns about the aggressive enforcement, but Hartwell had overruled their objections. The most damaging evidence was a recorded phone call between Hartwell and the HOA's attorney, where Hartwell explicitly stated that he intended to make an example of Margaret to deter other residents from challenging the board's authority. He used language that revealed his enforcement wasn't about community standards, it was about power and control. But wait, because this story gets even more incredible. While Margaret's legal team was building their case, the veteran community was conducting their own investigation. They'd obtained public records about Hartwell's military service claims. He'd never actually served in the military despite frequently implying that he had during board meetings. His tough guy enforcement persona was built on a foundation of lies and stolen valor. The revelation about Hartwell's false military claims was the final straw for many community residents. A petition to recall the entire HOA board began circulating and quickly gathered signatures from over 60% of homeowners. Local news crews were now stationed outside the community regularly, documenting the unfolding drama. Margaret found herself at the center of a movement she'd never intended to start. Veterans from 3 states had driven to support her. Legal experts were offering their services for free. Community advocacy groups were using her case as an example of HOA abuse and the need for legislative reform. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in August. Margaret's attorney had filed multiple motions challenging the validity of the liens and the selective enforcement practices. The courtroom was packed with supporters, media representatives, and curious observers who'd followed the story. Hartwell arrived with the HOA's expensive legal team, confident that the law was on their side. The covenants were legally binding contracts, and Margaret had clearly violated multiple provisions. In his mind, the emotional circumstances were irrelevant to the legal facts. But the judge had done his homework. He'd reviewed the evidence of selective enforcement, the pattern of escalating violations, and the circumstances surrounding Margaret's memorial garden. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of moral authority that cut through all of Hartwell's legal posturing. The judge dismissed the foreclosure action entirely, ruling that the HOA's enforcement had been discriminatory, excessive, and legally questionable. He went further, ordering the HOA to refund all fines collected from Margaret and issuing an injunction preventing any further enforcement actions related to her memorial garden. The courtroom erupted in applause, but the judge wasn't finished. He made it clear that he was referring the case to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation into potential civil rights violations and abuse of fiduciary duty by the HOA board. Hartwell's face was ashen as he realized his carefully constructed authority had just crumbled in front of an audience of people who would never let him forget this moment. The aftermath of Margaret's courtroom victory rippled through Willowbrook Estates like an earthquake, fundamentally changing the community's power structure and exposing years of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind manicured lawns and architectural guidelines. Within a week of the judge's ruling, Richard Hartwell submitted his resignation as HOA board president. His carefully worded statement cited personal reasons and the need to focus on family priorities. But everyone knew the real reason. The recall petition had gathered enough signatures to force a special election, and internal polling showed he would lose by a devastating margin. But Hartwell's downfall was just the beginning of the changes sweeping through the community. The state attorney general's investigation, sparked by the judge's referral, uncovered a pattern of governance violations that extended far beyond Margaret's case. Auditors discovered financial irregularities, including excessive legal fees, questionable contracts with board members' businesses, and reserve funds that had been improperly diverted to cover enforcement costs. Margaret's pro bono attorney had compiled documentation showing that over 40 homeowners had been subjected to selective enforcement over the past 3 years. The evidence revealed a systematic pattern of targeting residents who questioned board decisions, failed to volunteer for community events, or rubbed board members the wrong way. Mrs. Patterson, Margaret's neighbor, came forward with her own story of harassment after she'd complained about excessive landscaping fees. The Johnsons revealed they'd been cited for violations that didn't even exist in the covenant documents. An elderly veteran named Frank Morrison had been fined repeatedly for flying an American flag that allegedly violated size restrictions that somehow didn't apply to the oversized decorative flag displayed at Hartwell's own home. The investigation also revealed that Hartwell had been using his position for personal gain. His insurance business had received referrals for homeowner policies from new residents, creating a clear conflict of interest. His brother-in-law owned the management company handling day-to-day HOA operations, another undisclosed relationship that violated state regulations. Now here's something that will absolutely blow your mind about how this story continued to unfold. Margaret's case attracted national attention when it was featured on a popular podcast about HOA abuse stories. The episode, titled The Widow's Garden, became one of their most downloaded episodes and sparked conversations about HOA reform across the country. Margaret received letters from thousands of people sharing their own stories of HOA overreach and thanking her for standing up to the system. Legal scholars began citing Margaret's case in academic papers about property rights and community governance. Her victory established a precedent that would protect other homeowners facing similar situations. Law schools started using the case study to teach about selective enforcement and due process violations. But for Margaret personally, the most meaningful changes were much quieter and more profound. The memorial garden that had started this entire battle became a symbol of resilience and love that touched everyone who saw it. Neighbors who had previously only waved politely now stopped to chat about David's service and Margaret's beautiful flowers. Children walking to school would pause to smell the roses, and Margaret started keeping small watering cans available so they could help tend the garden. The community itself began to heal from years of fear-based governance. The new HOA board, elected after the recall, implemented transparent policies and eliminated the punitive enforcement practices that had made so many residents feel like prisoners in their own homes. They established a mediation process for addressing violations and created reasonable exceptions for circumstances like memorial gardens, holiday decorations, and accessibility modifications. Property values, which Hartwell had claimed to be protecting, actually increased after the negative publicity died down. Potential buyers were attracted to a community that had demonstrated its commitment to fairness and community spirit over rigid authoritarianism. Margaret used her experience to become an advocate for HOA reform at the state level. She testified before legislative committees about the need for oversight and accountability in community governance. Her testimony was instrumental in passing new laws requiring disclosure of board member conflicts of interest and establishing appeal processes for homeowner violations. The financial impact on the HOA was severe but necessary. Legal fees from defending the selective enforcement lawsuit exceeded $50,000. Refunding improper fines to affected homeowners cost another $30,000. The management company contract had to be rebid, resulting in higher costs but better service. Emergency assessments were required to cover the shortfall, and many homeowners blamed Hartwell's leadership for the financial burden. Several board members faced personal consequences as well. 2 members resigned in disgrace when their own undisclosed violations were revealed. The treasurer was investigated for potential embezzlement when reserve fund discrepancies couldn't be explained. Only the newest board member, who had consistently voted against Hartwell's enforcement actions, emerged with her reputation intact. Hartwell himself faced the most severe consequences. His insurance business lost several major clients who didn't want to be associated with his public humiliation. The Professional Licensing Board launched an investigation into his conduct that resulted in censure and mandatory ethics training. His social standing in the community was permanently damaged, and he eventually moved to another state to rebuild his life away from the constant reminders of his downfall. But perhaps the most powerful consequence was how Margaret's story inspired other communities dealing with similar abuse. HOA management companies across the region began reviewing their enforcement policies to avoid similar public relations disasters. Community associations started providing board members with training about fair enforcement and conflict resolution. Property management conferences began featuring sessions about avoiding the Willowbrook estate situation. Margaret received invitations to speak at homeowner conferences and community meetings throughout the state. Her message was always the same. Communities should support their residents during difficult times, not add to their burdens with petty enforcement and bureaucratic harassment. The memorial garden itself became a pilgrimage site for people dealing with grief and loss. Margaret welcomed visitors and shared David's story with anyone who wanted to listen. She created a small plaque near the bench that read, "In memory of Master Sergeant David Chen and all who served." Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest pain. On the anniversary of David's death, Margaret organized the first annual Memorial Garden Tour, where families throughout the community shared their own memorial spaces and stories of loved ones they'd lost. The event raised money for veteran support organizations and became a beloved community tradition. The legal precedent established by Margaret's case continued to protect homeowners facing similar situations. Her attorneys created a legal guide for challenging HOA overreach that was distributed free to homeowner advocacy groups nationwide. The guide became known as Margaret's Manual and helped countless families fight back against abusive governance. 3 years after that first violation notice arrived, Margaret still tends her memorial garden every morning. The flowers have grown fuller and more beautiful with each passing season, creating a riot of color that brings joy to everyone who sees it. David's bench remains the perfect spot for quiet reflection and morning coffee. Margaret often sits there in the early morning hours, watching the sunrise and thinking about the journey that brought her to this moment. She never intended to become a community activist or legal precedent. She just wanted to grieve her husband in peace and honor his memory with something beautiful. But sometimes the most important battles choose us, not the other way around. Margaret's strength in the face of institutional bullying inspired an entire community to demand better from their leaders and better from themselves. Her refusal to let petty bureaucrats strip away her dignity in her darkest hour became a beacon of hope for countless others facing similar struggles. The story of Margaret Chen and her memorial garden proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against abuse of power is simply refusing to be silenced. When people with authority forget that they serve their community rather than ruling over it, it takes ordinary citizens with extraordinary courage to remind them of their proper place. Margaret's garden still blooms every spring, a testament to love that transcends bureaucratic pettiness and the enduring power of standing up for what's right. David would be proud of the woman who honored his memory not just with flowers, but with the kind of principled stand that makes communities stronger and more compassionate. In the end, Willowbrook Estates became exactly what it was supposed to be all along. Not a place where rules mattered more than people, but a community where neighbors supported each other through life's challenges and celebrated the things that make us human. And sometimes, when Margaret is working in her garden on quiet Sunday mornings, she can almost hear David's voice on the wind, telling her he's proud of the fight she fought and the community she helped create. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Would you have had the strength to fight back against an entire system designed to crush individual voices? Let me know in the comments below, because Margaret's story reminds us all that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary courage.